Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today we're going to be talking about video games. This is an important area for me, basically because I grew up with video games, and it has been both something I've enjoyed greatly, but also has been a bit of a curse as well. Blessing and a curse in my life. So I think the notion here, the idea of why I'm wanting to talk about this is trying to figure out what is responsible consumption of video games? What does that look like? What should it even be? How do we tell if it's something that's healthy versus unhealthy for us? And there's a few layers to it. There's, what purpose does it serve? What is it replacing? Then there's also, honestly, commentary about the world at large and what purpose that can video games serve therein. I'm sure folks have analyzed this far greater than I have, but I'll hopefully bring a unique kind of psychology lens to it, as well as from personal experience. I think a lot of the critics of video games don't necessarily partake in them themselves. I think some have and some do, but I think some of the criticism levied can be from a point of an outsider looking in rather than an insider looking in. Now, I do note, I know folks who've played video games that will speak to the vice-like nature of them and thereby the dangers of them. So that does exist. But I'll try to thread a needle, I suppose, and try to find perhaps a middle ground. So I grew up with video games. My first console was a Sega Genesis, lovely system. Sonic the Hedgehog, Echo the Dolphin, lots of good memories from those. Although, full disclosure, I mostly watched my brother play the video games, and I did not always partake myself. Some of that's my own sort of anxiety. I've spoken to my anxiety and depression over the various episodes, but it just the performance aspect of it was very challenging and very frustrating for me sometimes to really get through video games. Echo the Dolphin, for example. When Echo is running out of air, and the sounds very stressful of trying to make sure that dolphin survived. And so, again, full disclosure, I did watch my brother play a lot of these video games. Then we got a PlayStation 1. Eventually had to turn it upside down for it to run CDs. Good memories, really fun memories. At the same time, though, one of the challenges for me is that video games, they're a bit of a time suck. They're a great time killer. They're something that you can do at home. Back in the day, they weren't social in nature unless you had friends over. I did not have many friends. The friends that I did have, they were more kind of acquaintances. There was one pretty good friend growing up, but not many folks in my social circle. And I think this creates a dangerous pairing because when you throw yourself into activities that take you away from social interaction, that can be really challenging, particularly for kids, because I needed to get out there and practice. And so when I look back and I can see, growing up, I would say, I would take it from the lens of they just don't get it, and I don't like to feel pressured, and I don't want and didn't want my parents to pressure me to go out and do extra, things outside of video games. I think they were right to push me, though, too. I think probably what would have been most helpful would probably have been therapy, a place to talk about it as well as go out and do it, because that's often what therapy helps bridge, is the gap between one's internal world and taking actual action in your life. Not saying I would have responded positively to therapy. And I imagine, as picky as I am now, I would still be quite picky growing up, but I think it would have been a good combo. And so I think video games, as even from a young age, while they were incredibly interesting and great stories and wonderful artistic expression, for me became a replacement for something. And so I think that's kind of my first point, and you're going to hear it as I move through my story further, is that's one of the biggest dangers, is what are you replacing? And this goes for any thing in our lives. I mean, this is what often people do with any substance or any activity, is what is it coming at the expense of? What is it trying to replace? And if it's ever coming at the expense of something, or it's ever trying to replace something, you could be in a danger zone. And again, I don't care what it is. It could be running, and athletics. Like that can get in the way of relationships and other things that are important to you as a human being. So this is not unique to video games, but something that video games are absolutely, I think, prone to, because they serve as a really rich escape from the real world. Now, I was not conscious of this, right? Like, I was real young. I didn't have that sort of notion, be like, oh, I'm going to do this instead, but it became a nasty habit. As I grew up, AOL came out, online milieus for interacting with people. Again, a wonderful sort of intermediary to go out there and try to interact with, well, they're people, but, who were they really? It was kind of questionable on AIM and ICQ and various of the early chat programs. Was, again, in many ways, a healthy way for me to practice expressing myself. But I wasn't using it as like a stepping stone, because I think that's where it can really be helpful. It's like you can start in an online milieu to kind of explore yourself. It's another way, it's another method to explore yourself, but it cannot be the only way. And so once again, it becomes about like diversification. Is it replacing something? And so the answer for me again was it became more of a replacement rather than like a conduit to going out there and trying out in the real world as well. Then I got into some of the first-person shooters back in the day. Team Fortress Classic was my vice. What was cool is, I had a lot of performance anxiety in competitive sports. I would do pretty well, like, shooting a basketball, playing catch, those sorts of things. But when it came to game day, I just would fall apart. I'm not prone to anxiety attacks. I over-contain. I'm more likely to develop an ulcer than have a panic attack. I remember, I think I quit soccer shortly after. I remember feeling like I had some sort of like breathing issue, but in retrospect, it was more than likely a panic attack. It was not like asthma or anything like that. I've never really dealt with that, I don't think. But it was basically a panic issue and then really severe performance anxiety. And so these first-person shooters, the community organized methods of competing with one another. This is before esports was a thing. These lovely folks would pool together money, these administrators, and give out gift cards and stuff as rewards for the who won certain tournaments. I mean, it's just a really cool kind of social experiment of people online via forums. And chat mediums, like finding ways to create a competitive atmosphere. And so I got to flex that muscle, which is kind of cool. Performance on a video game is still performance nonetheless. But it was also less visible, less required social interaction. There's definitely teamwork, cooperation, communication. You have a voice chat to be calling out what's happening and what you need. If you get knocked out, you need someone to cover a particular avenue. I'm using broad terms here. Or something that you're noticing that the enemy team is doing. You can call that out, but again, it has this asterisk of like, okay, it's not fully the same. It's not. It still could be replacing something, and indeed, it was replacing something for me. Also, like, how did I deal with difficult emotions? One of the challenges was like, I was young. This is like teenage years. I would have a hard time with losing. I felt incompetent in most areas of my life, and so feeling as though I was incompetent or not measuring up in the guild or the team that I was on was really challenging. And there's no real milieu to kind of work with that. At best, like if you got too heated over voice chat, they just mute you. Like say you're losing real bad and I get real heated and just annoyed and upset at myself or something that's happening, they just like mute me. Didn't happen often, but every once in a while I get pretty frustrated and just not healthy expression. The other challenge too is the early days of the internet were not really moderated terribly well, and so there was really just not a lot of fun language going on around there. It was the kind of cliche term these days, toxic. like, it was lovely and embracing in many ways, but it also had a lot of kind of toxic elements, especially for young boys. I think it was really not a good environment to be in. And there's a direct through line, I think, to the current day, quote unquote, incels. Grew up, I think, often proxy to this culture. And it was a little bit counterculture. But in many ways, I think it's just like when you put a bunch of, I mean, there were girls playing too, but it just wasn't as popular back then. But when you put a bunch of boys together in a milieu where they feel more free to communicate, but there's really not a lot of societies supporting how for boys to like healthily interact with one another, unregulated on the internet, with a wide array of age ranges, I think was a recipe for disaster. Again, important in some rights, but then in other ways was not terribly healthy. Slur words and stuff that, ashamedly I would use while playing the games because it was what everybody was doing. And it just, it just wasn't appropriate. And yeah, just not a great experience all around. So once again, it provided this interesting approximation that I imagine if I was doing this, and I was more fully formed as a human being in my like late 20s, it wouldn't be an issue, right? Like, okay, social pressure's no big deal, but was just a really challenging place to exist. I mean, heck, even if I was in my 20s, I think it'd be challenging. Then I got into MMOs. These are massively MMOs, massively multiplayer online. There we go. First Final Fantasy online one, and competitive in link shells, across, I forget if they call them servers or realms or whatever. Then I got into World of Warcraft, and these were particularly dangerous. I mean, super cool because the amount of people that you can interact with on a whim like went up tenfold. You still had forums, there were more online chat options, more voice options. But then in these massive worlds, you really got to know, quote unquote, a number of people. It was really fun. I mean, it was really a way to connect even further. And at the same time, though, provided me more of an excuse to be like, well, again, now I'm getting my socialization and this should be enough, blah, 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 blah. But again, it was a replacement for something else, which is where the danger was. Number two is the addictive nature of it. I've alluded to this already, is that I had a deficit in a sense of achievement and a sense of self-esteem. And so, some people call video games predatory in this regard, but I think we can get addicted to achievement no matter where we're at. The challenge with games is they make those achievements far more explicit and far more frequent, and that gets you hooked. Now, I truly don't believe that there's something inherently malicious about this. I don't think the games were developed like, guess what we're going to do? We're going to make it so that people get addicted and throw their lives away. The nature of the beast, the way the games are created, they're very involved. And that was the point. The point was to get people immersed in something. And when you immerse someone, there's going to be all these things that you're getting out of life. It'd be like if I left my room every day and went out on adventures in the world and just like randomly ran into people and was like, hey, you need anything? Hey, what's your name? What is it that you want? Okay, cool. Now I'm building a reputation in the city. That's pretty cool. And then I get things for like, if you transpose this onto real life, that's just kind of human nature. You would seek these things out. So I think they're inadvertently, they can become predatory and addictive. But I don't think that was the beginning design of these types of games. Was like, how can we keep people as hooked as humanly possible? I refuse to believe the early, conversations in these game development rooms are like, how can we get people unhealthily addicted? No, it's just the nature of the beast. What they created had a high propensity for addiction because you're just getting dopamine hits all the time for achievement. And the longer you spend on it, the more you could get, because it's an online game that's always running. It's always running. So of course there's always opportunities. Over time, that's where they start adding the achievements. You see consoles adding achievement systems and reward systems and all this other stuff. And that's where you start getting into this interesting realm where now they're giving you carrots on a stick. And then the games now, over the last, as I say now too many times, it's hard to say. Basically with mobile games and monetization, that's where it's getting a little bit dicey. Because people made an obvious link of like, well, There's tons of content. You can endlessly engage that content, and there's achievement hunting. And guess what? We can monetize the achievements. That's where I think it's gotten a little bit dirty. Because in the past, it's, plausible deniability at worst. Like, well, we're just giving people more to do. It's just a thing on the screen. It doesn't actually have any intrinsic value. Now it's like, whoa, you want that achievement? You're going to have to pay some money to get there quicker. Ugh, not so good, not so good. But the MMOs served this dual purpose for me. It was a replacement, which is the challenge, but in many ways was another milieu where I got to experience art and storytelling and lore and all these really cool things. So many creative people in the world creating this. Never mind meeting legitimately cool people that I will never see again. But to this day, I can think back of some, like, they seemed like really cool people. I don't care if they were lying about their identity, or who they were, or what age they were. They seemed like genuinely cool people, and that's nice. I don't regret having, quote unquote, or met with an asterisk these people. And again, I have not met many people that I have known online. The closest was a QuakeCon or those sorts of things, where a bunch of folks bring their computers. I think I attended one or two of those, and then some with my brother and his friends. So they're wonderful mediums of expression, and I've been super pleased to see the industry evolve. And there's all sorts of neat arts and puzzle games, and arts is in like the very artistic based games. Having the emphasis on storytelling above all else, that you don't need action all the time. I mean, maybe that's just because I'm old now, but the ones that are much more visual and much more story based, much more abstract, are just beautiful expressions of people and their creativity and the human experience. I mean, just wonderful, wonderful things. But at the end of the day, they suck you in, and they can steal you away from the real world. And the way I describe this to folks is games in many ways are a manifestation of the world of fantasy. And we all have fantasy. Fantasy is a beautiful, beautiful thing. The danger of fantasy is when we want to live solely in fantasy, because the world on the outside doesn't hold the allure that fantasy does. So we all need fantasy in our lives. A healthy and rich fantasy world is essential to healthy human functioning. However, if we get lost in fantasy, we can begin to lose touch with reality. And when we lose touch with reality, we lose touch with another part of ourselves. Another way to put it is, if we need to have a healthy attachment with our internal worlds and our fantasy world, just as much as we need a healthy attachment with the real world and the world of others. And if we lean too heavily on one or the other, we can find ourselves in a pickle. And the risk, I think, at a really macro level, the risk of video games is they provide a really rich world of fantasy within which we can get lost. We can escape into it at any time. And as the world becomes more challenging and difficult and layered and scary and unpredictable, this is the inherent risk and danger of video games, is that they become potentially a source of escape rather than expression, or, heaven forbid, killing a little bit of time. So those are those are some of my thoughts on video games. I love them. To this day, I still play them. One of them, a monetized phone game, which I excuse because I have the money to do it, and it's a quicker way than diving deep into something else. That's the rationale, at least, that I use for playing it. But there's some other ones too I really enjoy. And at the same time, it's not coming at the expense of much. I won't say anything, because there's, I always think sometimes when I sit down for a couple hours and go, well, I could do something else. But as long as I'm not actively avoiding those something else's, and that there's a balance between these forces, at the end of the day, I think I'm doing okay. And, that though in of itself is a journey. It took me a while to get to that place. I feel like we need to have these conversations more frequently, more fruitfully with one another about how to have healthy relationships with video games, rather than what often feels like is the conversation that's kind of all good or all bad, rather than somewhere in the in-between. So in the essence of keeping this short, I will cut that off here and end the episode. But again, some initial thoughts on both first, my relationship with video games and some disclosure about my history with video games, not all of it, but a lot of it, as well as some thoughts about how do we tell the difference between a healthy engagement with video games versus something that could be unhealthy. As always, I think and hope, man, I'm off today. I hope it has been thought-provoking, and I appreciate you for listening and watching. Stay curious.